So today, Ron DeSantis signed a anti-protesting bill into law, and I have a couple things to say about this. So first, let me just give you like some of the details about what's in the legislation. So there's a provision in there that this one is getting a lot of airplay. This one's getting a lot of talk, where it would give immunity to somebody who hits a protester with their car if they claim that they're defending themselves. It gives them immunity in civil court, and that's a very important distinction, and I'll get into why a little bit later. Also, another talked about provision in this bill is how they clearly try to over broaden the legal definition for what a riot is in an attempt to provide cover for the police to break up lawful, peaceful protest. And they're trying to say that all it takes for a riot to be declared is, I believe, 3 or more people doing some type of violence or property damage. And then you get, like I said, you get to declare everybody who's participating in civil disobedience. You get to say that they're all participating in a riot, which is ridiculous. And like I said, I'll get into that a little bit later. And then there's also provisions in there to deny bail to any protester who's arrested and declared a rioter until their first court appearance. So they can't make bail until they appear in court. And this was specifically written that way to prevent people who were arrested at protests from getting bailed out and joining the protesters later. That was explicit. And then there's also a provision in there to increase penalties for people accused of assaulting a police officer at a protest. And all right, so let me get to the first part. The liability or the immunity for somebody who hits a protester with their car, somebody who's blocking traffic. I mean, on its face, that's ridiculous because protests oftentimes do end up blocking traffic. Just like parades block traffic, protests and civil disobedience and direct actions, if they're done correctly, they will block the streets. So that's part of people's First Amendment right to free speech and to protest. So to say, oh, if there are protesters in the street, you get to run them down with your car and you'll get immunity. And they word it and they say, oh, if you feel like your life is threatened and you have to defend yourself. But as we know, most of the time, like with those stand your ground laws, especially here in Florida, it's just, like I said, it's just legal cover and it's oftentimes abused to cover up actual misdeeds. But the important part here, which I think a lot of people leave out of this discussion, is it's civil immunity. It has nothing to do with a criminal case. So if you did run over a protester and you killed them, injured them, whatever it is, you can still be charged criminally. You just can't be charged civilly. And the difference is criminal. If it's a criminal case, that means the state is prosecuting you for a crime and you'll face jail time or prison time or whatever the punishment is. If you have civil immunity, that means in civil court. So say you hit somebody with a car and they sue you or their family sues you. This law will give you immunity if you claim it was in self-defense. But honestly, I think it makes it almost useless. This provision is almost useless because first, you hit somebody with the car, there's going to be a criminal investigation and likely a criminal prosecution. And honestly, this is kind of, I think he's trolling off of the murder of Heather Heyer in from back in Charlottesville. I believe it was 2017 or 2018. She was hit and killed by a Trump supporter, and ran over at a protest, and she was killed. So this is kind of like trolling like that, trying to trigger the libs, because it ultimately, that provision of the bill, it doesn't really do anything, and it sounds all it sounds worse than it is, and it's hard to explain. It sounds worse than it is because, okay, you hit somebody with the car. Let's use the example of Heather Heyer. She was hit by the car. Say this happened here in Florida. The person who hit her would still be charged with a crime, just like he was charged with a crime in Charlottesville. He would still be charged with a crime here in Florida, and there would be a criminal prosecution. There would be a whole trial and all that stuff. And if he's found guilty, he'd go to prison. In that case, he went to prison he got a life sentence. So the whole criminal process would still continue if somebody hit a protester with their car. It's just in civil court. But the what makes it really moot, this provision, is before you'd have even a civil trial or civil case or civil lawsuit, there would be the criminal case. And if the person was found guilty in the criminal case, then they were doing it in self-defense qualification, it doesn't apply because a jury found that you weren't acting in self-defense, you just killed somebody with your car. And if you get convicted in the criminal case, then you don't have that type of immunity in the civil case. So I think, like I said, I think that provision is just meant to trigger the libs, and it's like Ron DeSantis trolling and making it seem like, oh, he's going to legalize running over protesters, but that's really not what happened here. But I will acknowledge it will definitely, there's a chance that maybe it encourages some people to do it, but it's not like he's giving license to run over any protester and you won't be charged criminally. So that's an important thing to clarify. And then also, so now the part about expanding the definition of a riot. Now, this is something that really irked me, because clearly what they're trying to do is find any reason to try to declare lawful, peaceful protest unlawful to justify a police crackdown and to break it up. And like, the intent there is so against free speech. It's so against people's constitutional right to protest. And because what other reason would there even be to write a provision like that? It's not like whatever crime, if you can point to one person committing a crime, violence, property damage, whatever it is, and you have evidence that that person committed a crime, there are already laws for you to prosecute that person and put them in prison. There's laws already in place for you to prosecute anybody who is committing that crime with them. But when you act like all it takes is 2-3 people in a crowd of thousands of people to commit a crime, and now everybody who's there at the protest is committing a crime, clearly that's just a backdoor approach to try to criminalize protest. And it really goes to show you the how serious the police state here is in the United States. And I try to explain this to people, but it's really hard to, without sounding hyperbolic, without sounding conspiratorial. But this really is a police state, because look at what is going into this provision in the bill and the whole law in general. The governor and the state legislature, powerful bodies of government that are supposed to be governing on behalf of the people, serving the people. What they instead were spending their time on is let's craft a law, let's craft this provision to make it so that we can go after people exercising their First Amendment. Let's do something that it is explicitly unconstitutional to break up protests. So let's try to find a way around that. So the like I said, instead of the government figuring out how they can serve the people, serve the will of the people, do what the people want them to do in regards to legislation, they're spending their time and energy trying to take people's rights away from them and put that into law. That's what the government is doing here. So, but now I have, again, a bit of a nuanced take on this provision. And it kind of, like I said, you can extrapolate this to the entire law itself, most parts of this law. Okay, so yeah, in the bill, they have that provision that expands the definition of a riot. But what will that effect will that have in practice? Because without that law in place, we already see how the police act at protests. They act like it's already an unlawful event. They're already out there assaulting all the protesters who are peacefully protesting, already out there doing false arrests. We've seen them do it all last year in Florida and every state in this country. So, I mean, you'd be putting it into law, but it's already kind of in effect because the police already act like they're at war with peaceful protesters anyway. You see how they show up with military equipment. You see how they start shooting out rubber bullets and tear gas and shit like that. So they already act like peaceful protesters are criminals. So, I mean, that's not to say that the all of what went into this bill that's not to say it isn't bad, but what is it really changing here? Because like I said, we're already in the police state and the police are already out of control and assault people who peacefully protest anyway. They already do these false arrests anyway. So like I said earlier with the provision about the civil immunity, this just seems like he's virtue signaling. It just seems like he's, playing to his base. Oh, look, Trump supporters. Oh, I hate the Black Lives Matter protesters just like you do. Aren't I so cool? Come out and vote for me, my re-election. That kind of just seems like the whole point of some of these provisions and really the law in general. Because in practice, how much is it really changing things? And then something else, the one point I want to make about this is look at the priorities here. Aside from the fact we're in a pandemic and the worst economic crisis in history, and the government should be doing everything in their power to address this unprecedented emergency, put that aside for a moment, which is hard to do because that's an incredibly important piece of context. But let's just operate solely in this space of protest and making laws about what happened at protests last year. The fact that they spent all this time and energy crafting legislation to go after protesters, and this explicitly is targeting protesters. And what have they done about the endless videos we saw of Florida police officers, like I said, brutalizing protesters, peaceful protesters, violating their constitutional right, doing false arrests, and all those things? Where's the legislation to deal with that? Huh? Where are the investigations and the prosecutions of the police officers on camera breaking the law and assaulting protesters and doing false arrests? Where's the legislation? Where's the urgency to deal with that problem? Because if you want to talk about what was a bigger problem at those protests last year, were they rioting? Of course they was rioting. I saw videos of people running up in fucking like the outlets and some of the shopping malls and just running up in stores and stealing shit. Okay, that was a thing too. But it wasn't as common as you would think. And also, that wasn't as prevalent and as big a problem as, like I said, every single police department, every single precinct in this state, where we have officers paid with tax dollars to protect and serve the community, instead going to war against the community and assaulting the citizens that they're supposed to be protecting. So they're getting paid by the government, by our tax dollars, and these are agents of the government who are breaking the law and brutalizing people. So I think if we lived in a sane world, that would take precedence over some of the people who broke into some stores, because that's a bigger problem. That points to lawless, out of control, unaccountable police. The people who have a monopoly on violence, the people who are supposed to be enforcing the law, they're the most lawless and they're the ones who are the most out of control. I think if you're a government official, if you're the governor, if you're a state legislator, and you're supposed to be overseeing those police departments, I think you should get your own house in order before you start policing peaceful protesters in the street. And that's the thing here. And I'll finish in this. A lot of times when it comes to laws and stuff like that, there's a debate about, are they stupid or are they, is this malicious? This is one of those cases where it's just clearly malicious. It's not like they're doing this to protect the community. It's not out of or anything like that. This is just I think really he's just trying to rile up the base before his re-election. I honestly think that's what a lot of this is, because like I said, you go into some of these specific provisions, it doesn't really change what is happening in practice. The civil immunity, it really means nothing if you hit somebody with your car and you get prosecuted and convicted criminally. That civil immunity thing, it means absolutely nothing. The turning the protest into a riot if 3 people do some violence. And by the way, notice how easy they're trying to make it to declare a riot. And we already know that there are infiltrators, there are people who go to these protests and on purpose try to stir shit up. Remember those videos of the guy in the umbrella man who was going around breaking windows and shit, just doing some random shit at protesters, and protesters were following him around like, what the fuck are you doing? And so you have stuff like that. And then you also have all the examples in police departments and precincts across the country where the police officers were setting piles of bricks around these protests, hoping that people will pick up the bricks and start throwing them and breaking windows and shit. So the police already kind of try to instigate this behavior, and then you see what they're doing with the whole thing to try to expand the definition of riot. So all it takes is 2 or 3 people to pick up some of those bricks that the police left to have the whole thing declared a riot. But like I said, anyway, they already operate that way anyway. So it's not like the most egregious part of this bill. I don't really think it's, besides the part about the bail, because that's really changing something. But other than that, I don't think that a lot of this law changes anything, but it's so clear how authoritarian and the governor is, Ron DeSantis is, and the Republicans in this state.